At this place in history, we're in Jericho. I'm with Executive Director of the Vermont Historical Society, Steve Perkins. And Steve, I can kind of guess why we're here. I'm thinking it's that big red building behind us.
It is that big red building, and as the sign says, Chittenden Mills, some people call it the Old Red Mill, but it's a great example of an early Vermont grist mill. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what that means and how this was preserved. It's one of the few places where you can come see this today.
So how old is this mill? Can you give us a little bit of the background?
Sure, well this mill goes back to the early 19th century, so that's the early 1800s. And we're on the Browns River, which is a pretty flat, fast flowing river that goes down to the Winooski River. And there were 7 different mill sites along this river alone, and this was one of them. This was mill number 2. So water power that moves a water wheel, which can, run just about any kind of machinery. This site started out as a starch mill, but it really wasn't until the 1850s that things started to get going and it turned it into a grist mill. So you're looking at, this is often called a mill race, so the water is flowing down right next to the building, and in its early years there would have been a water wheel attached right where that stone structure is that would turn. So a grist mill made flour. And so they took grain in both from Vermont and also from the Midwest, came in on the train. And it used big, huge stones, mill stones. And they, like my hand, like this, it would sit on top of each other and they'd turn like this. And that would grind the grain in between the stones. And that ran with a water wheel. The Howe family bought the mill and they said, boy, we can make a lot of money by grinding as much grain as possible, but the old water wheel's not going to work, and these old grinding stones aren't going to work. So they put in rollers, which were brand new technology for New England at the time. This was probably the first mill to have grain rollers. And those are big, huge stone, well, as it sounds, rollers. So rather than discs that grind, they're rollers that roll like this. But they needed to put in turbines. So like a power plant, they had turbines. They realized that the flow of water wasn't fast enough to run the turbines, so they threw some dynamite in here and they blew this gorge out even deeper so that the water would run faster so that they could run their turbines. They also made the mill bigger. It was all a stone building. They added a wood structure in this tower to the top. And it's covered with a metal siding, which is really kind of cool. What I love is it still has the tower on it. This goes back to how do we use gravity to our best advantage? So they bring the grain in and the grain would get taken up to the top of the tower and then they would pour the grain down and it would fall through chutes down into the rollers. And as it fell through the rollers would turn it into flour and then the flour would come out at the bottom where they could bag it and then send it off to be sold.
So how long was this in operation? This
was in operation up to the 1920s. And then the town decided we need to save it because it's still in really good shape.
Yeah.
The town bought it and in 1975 sold it to the Jericho Historical Society, which raised the money to restore the building. And they've got a little small museum inside, so I think we should go inside and see what they have.
So now we've moved inside. There's a beautiful store here with all kinds of fun Vermont products. But you talked about the roller mill outside. Is that what this contraption is?
That's what this is. And it looks like, they've saved some of them and they're still installed, probably because they're too heavy to move. But the grain would come down from up above through these chutes into this contraption, and you can see all the belts and pulleys and everything that would run off that water power, and it would turn rollers inside here and flour would come out the bottom. So, and then on the other side of the room, they actually have a really cool chute where they could pack flour into barrels and bags. There's little pieces of the mill throughout the space, and one is this hopper, which is used for filling barrels or bags with flour, and it still has the machinery on it that was run by the belt, so you can see how everything worked in this space.
So Steve, now we've come back outside the mill, but we're behind it this time. The river is gorgeous. There are trails back here to explore. Really fun place. At this place in history.